All right, so once more, this is the How to Infuse Ethical AI in Your Organization Strategy webinar presented by Inclusion Geeks. I know folks are already saying hello in the chat, so please feel free to keep that coming. Excited to see those of you who we've seen before, and for those of you who are new to us, welcome, and it's great to have you here. All right, so let's get into it. Really quickly, my name is Felicia. I am your facilitator for today. I'm one of the co-founders and lead partners here at Inclusion Geeks. I am based out in Western Massachusetts, although today I'm joining you from sunny San Diego. So, what is time? What is space? Where are we all located? We're in the clouds, but I'm excited to be here with you virtually, all of you from all over the world as I'm seeing your chats come through. Really quickly, in case you are not familiar with Inclusion Geeks, our mission is to design a future of work that works for everyone. And so we put on these webinars monthly and are always exploring different topics. And some of these topics are pieces of content that we have really deep, long form programs around. And some of these are more exploratory content ideas and topics that we are ourselves exploring a little bit more. I put a couple quick fun facts about myself up on the screen. I am a cat parent. I am married to a donut maker, but those things are not what we're going to be talking about today, because what we are talking about today is really AI. So briefly, before we get into the good stuff, here's a couple different ways that you all will be able to engage with myself and my partner, Rachel, while on this webinar. So this is an hour long. We'll end right at the top of the hour. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments along the way, please feel free to put those in the chat. We will be keeping a close eye on that and love a good chat session. We will have some dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if you do have some specific questions, whether you submitted them to us through the Eventbrite beforehand, or if you have questions that pop up along the way, we'll have some time to address those at the end, and we can take those verbally through chat or in any other way that makes sense for us. We have all the different Zoom tools available to us. And I also want to note really quickly that if you need to adjust anything on your end, feel free to do things like use the speaker view for better access to my view. You can also turn on closed captions if that's helpful for you. I always find it helpful as someone who is hard of hearing. So I have closed captions enabled for myself, but if you don't need them, then don't worry about it and just sit back, relax, and learn a little bit with us. All right, so before we get into AI, I want to quickly talk about the fact that we are just at the very tail end of Black History Month here in the United States. And I know that not everyone on our webinar today is from the US, but we are based in the US and we are a US company. And so really quickly want to just name this. These observances are really essential parts of the story of our country. As a quick side note for anyone who needs a refresher or a reminder, Black History Month has been observed in various forms since 1926, when our author Carter Woodson led a national campaign to celebrate the achievement of Black Americans. And really, his goal was to ensure that we were exposed to honest, authentic Black history and really stories that went beyond racist tropes and accounts of just slavery. Black History Month was officially recognized in February by President Gerald Ford in 1976, and since then, every president has recognized this observance since. This year's theme is a century of Black history commemorations. And so this marks the 100th anniversary of the first Negro History Week in 1926. And the theme highlights the evolution of Black history, focusing on preserving, protecting, and promoting Black stories in the face of efforts to restrict them. So the theme actually calls for planting trees and actually they call it Trees of Truth, to combat the distortion of history. And I wanted to highlight that for our webinar today because while our main topic is artificial intelligence and ethical AI, I think it's so pertinent. This theme just feels so relevant for our discussion today, given that we are seeing more and more research coming out about how AI is distorting, erasing, or negatively recontextualizing Black history and Black culture. And a lot of this stems from underlying biases that are found in training data, which we're going to talk a lot more about. But these training data are not always neutral. They can reflect prejudices and algorithms that default to Eurocentric narratives. So I do think it's actually a really pertinent tie-in. So in any case, happy Black History Month. All right, so let's talk a little bit about just the background of AI landscape and context first, because I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, and there's so much to get into for today. But I want to zoom out a little bit to start off with to take a look at the broader context first. So, first, I want to talk about what is AI. So, before I click and show you my definitions, I would actually love to know if you all have any definitions of your own. So, feel free to put in the chat if you have a good idea or a good definition that you want to share with us. What is AI? And I feel like we're talking so much about it, it's in the zeitgeist, everyone's using it or not using it or has feelings about it. But what are we actually even talking about when we talk about AI? And yes, and to Rachel's point, can you answer this question without asking AI? You don't have to tell us yes or no, but again, a lot of us are using this right now. And I see folks already chatting in and saying, it's a waste of time. I'm going back to encyclopedias. That's definitely one way of doing it. And I totally feel that as well. All right, I'll give it another 30 seconds in case anyone is furiously typing away with a really great definition. But if you're sitting here and you're thinking to yourself, Felicia, this is literally why I'm in this webinar, I want you to tell me, totally fine, I do have definitions. All right, I see one or two chats coming through, so let me read off here. So Chelsea says, you prefer to be a bit more specific. So instead of AI broadly, you're naming the kind of AI, for example, LLMs for text generation. Yep, thanks. That's a good planting the seed. Chelsea, we're going to definitely talk about that. Anne says it's a way to offload admin tasks so I can open up my brain to do more deep and critical thinking. A lot of people agree with you, Anne. The Discovery Museum says simulation of human action activities. Tamara says machines doing human cognitive work. I love all of this. Yes. And if you are still typing away and you have some more thoughts, feel free to keep that coming through. Let me go ahead and share my definition. And actually, this is from the Oxford Dictionary and how, oops, I'm going a little bit too far ahead. How they're defining artificial intelligence is the theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, decision making, and translation between languages. How does that feel for you? If you're like, that feels kind of generic, or yes, I agree with that, let us know in the chat. I want to note that spoiler alert, I did use AI to help me create this webinar, and we use it in Inclusion Geeks from time to time. And we can talk more about how we use it and all of those considerations around that. But when I asked Claude, which is our AI of choice here at Inclusion Geeks, what AI was, it actually gave me a really similar answer. So I asked, what is AI? And it told me at its core, AI refers to computer systems that can perform tasks that typically require human intelligence. So this includes things like recognizing patterns, making predictions, understanding language, and generating content. Now, I see there's a couple more chats coming through, so let me take a quick look and see what you all are sharing. It's a bunch of code that's really, really good at detecting patterns. And yes, it is, AI, at least at this point in time, it's not another human being. It's not a sentient entity. It is a computer system. And what I always kind of like to default to is AI is a tool. All right, so with this definition in mind, let's talk about AI a little bit deeper. And I find that it's really helpful to think about AI as sort of being on a spectrum. So, on the one hand, you have really narrow or specialized AI, which are systems that are designed to do specific tasks really well. So, this could include things like, let me click to show you what this could include: spam filters, recommendation algorithms on, to platforms like Netflix or Amazon. So you go on and you sign in, and it's like, you might like this. And you think to yourself, you're right, I actually would like this. And so AI is behind the scenes kind of predicting based off of your data and your usage patterns. Voice assistants like Siri or Alexa, fraud detection systems in areas like banking. So that's examples of really narrow, very specialized AI. So they're designed to do a specific task and do it really, really well. On the other end, you also have generative AI, and this is the newer technology that's getting a lot of attention, especially lately. So, generative AI is a type of AI that creates new content. So, that's things like text, images, code, and it's creating based on what it's learned from existing data. So this could include things like ChatGPT, Claude, which we've already talked about, other text generation tools, image generators like Dolly or Midjourney, AI that can write code, summarize documents, draft emails, That's all included in what we're calling generative AI. Now, I do want to take a sort of quick pause and note that some people are using tools or describing AI through tools like ChatGPT, for example, to describe all AI. But that's not exactly right because ChatGPT, Claude, they're examples of generative AI. They're large language models or LLMs, as someone's mentioned already in chat, that are designed to have these conversational interactions. But AI in and of itself is really a much broader field that encompasses all these different ways that we can enable machines to perform tasks that typically require human intelligence. So things like ChatGPT is still a really, really popular tool among generative AI users. I would say probably followed then by maybe Claude or Gemini. We've got Meta AI, we've got Microsoft Copilot, we've got a lot of other things out there, but it's not a person, it's not even a search engine, which is an interesting use case that I'm personally seeing a lot of people starting to use these tools to act as a search engine. And also, these tools are not always right. They can lie to you. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But that's kind of, again, the overall landscape there. These were the top 10 generative AI use cases from last year. And if you attended our AI webinar from last summer, you might recognize this. So this is still sort of the top 10 here. And what we're looking at with this particular chart is that there has been a shift from more technical to more emotional applications. And in particular, we've seen a lot of growth in the last year or so in areas like therapy, personal productivity, and personal development. Therapy is really the clear top new use case in this area, and personal and professional support is the largest theme by far, taking most of its growth from technical assistance and troubleshooting. I do find this a little bit disturbing in all honesty because it aligns with what I've noted personally on a more anecdotal basis, which is I've been seeing so many more stories come up, especially in the last couple of months or so, of people posting and sharing that they're using these tools and these platforms as therapists, as mental health support, as friends. And there's been so many stories that there's really too many to choose from, but so many stories of people getting into relationships with their AI, version of ChatGPT or proposing to their chatbot over actual human interaction. So I do think, we're not going to spend all of our time today talking about those sorts of examples and use cases per se, but these are things to keep in mind. And these kind of use cases are things that we need to keep in mind when we're using and talking about how and can we use an ethical lens with regards to this new technology. So, in terms of what AI can currently do and not do, here's a couple things that AI can do well. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit in just a second about what it's not that great at. So, what AI does well is pattern recognition, just across the board to begin with. So, pattern recognition, especially at scale. So, analyzing really large, vast amounts of data faster than humans ever could. So, think things like, again, detecting fraud patterns, medical imaging, things like that. Repetitive tasks, so the boring stuff. Although I will say, as a side note, Rachel and I both love a good spreadsheet and data entry day, but it can be really boring. It is very repetitive, right? So data entry, scheduling, customer inquiries. We've all seen the little AI chatbot pop up when we're trying to engage with the customer service agent, right? Transcription's another area too. Content generation, so first drafts of writing, helping to brainstorm ideas, summarizing long documents. We've also seen that pop up a lot more, right? Summarizing what something is saying. I just got a text message this morning, and I have, for whatever reason now, in my text messages, I have a little AI generated summary of the text. So I don't even have to look at the text message. I can see what the summary says. Do I love that? Not necessarily, but that's something that's happening in real time. Also, language translation and processing. So again, this is becoming increasingly sophisticated across multiple different languages. And there may be other use cases too. So if you have experience with what AI is helping you to do really well, definitely put that in the chat and let us know. Here's what AI struggles with, in all honesty, still. True understanding and context. So AI does recognize patterns. That's what it's really good at, but it doesn't necessarily understand meaning in the way that humans do still or yet. It really struggles with creativity, especially being creative, where you really need a genuine sort of like nugget of a new novel idea. Because what AI is really doing is it's taking from existing content, images, whatever it might be, and remixing it rather than creating something truly from scratch. It's still struggling with ethical judgment and nuance, so it's not good at weighing competing values or understanding things like cultural context. Not great at handling unprecedented situations, so AI tends to perform poorly when it's facing scenarios that are outside of the training data that it's been trained on. Common sense reasoning, so it can make mistakes that might seem really obviously wrong to humans. And empathy and emotional intelligence. So it can simulate an empathetic response. And I'm sure a lot of us have had this kind of interaction with a tool that we've used, right? Where we're like, oh, it's like pumping me up and making me feel really good, or it's giving me compliments. And we get that little boost of serotonin or, feeling good about ourselves. But AI doesn't really truly feel or understand human emotion, at least, again, not yet or not at this point. And again, if there's other things that you've seen in your experiences that AI has struggled with, let us know in chat as well. So with that in mind, I want to do a quick check with you all. So my question for you is, where is your organization right now in its AI journey? Or if maybe you're working for yourself or you're not working, or you'd like to answer the question a little bit differently, where are you in your AI journey? And so what I'm going to do is pop up this Slido. So it's a little bit of a poll here. So we've got a couple different options. So as always, if you're familiar with Slido, go ahead and answer the poll. If this is the first time that you're using this technology, grab a device and get that QR code. If that's not available or accessible, or it's not working for some reason, which happens from time to time, you can go directly to slido.com and use that code 1466155, and you should be able to get in here as well. Your answer options are just exploring, we're piloting, we're scaling, we're not using AI at all, we're at full implementation, or something else. Maybe there's something that's not represented in these poll options, and if that's the case, let us know in chat. I see people are in here clicking away. So while you're doing that, I'm going to take a quick pause and look at the chat to make sure I haven't missed anything. And then in about 30 seconds or so, we'll come back together and we'll see where we all are, whether it's at an organizational level or at a personal level or both. All right. And yeah, so I'm seeing in chat, just for anyone who's not also been paying attention either. So we've been having discussions around the Roomba horror stories. We have people mentioning that Google search leads with AI results now, which I personally do not love. Canva's AI does tend to help with making a good start for a slide deck. So this is a great example from Nick about, how to sort of help us get started, but not necessarily do everything for humans. People are talking about this, what we're calling the cheerleader language that AI can bring when we're engaging. And, it's sort of this like, rah, rah, you're so smart, you're so amazing, you're right on track, right? We've all sort of had these, or I should say, let me not assume, maybe a lot of us have had these kind of interactions with when we're working with AI tools, if we're doing that. And yes, if folks are wanting to share something, I see someone shared that they're at implementation level at the organizational level, but not necessarily in their personal level. All right, so it looks like we are pretty slowed down on the poll. So let's take a pause and see where we are. So, and yes, if you're still recording your vote, feel free to keep going. It'll update automatically. So it looks like we've got a tie between just exploring and implementation. So we definitely got a lot of us folks here today. We're like, all right, we're in it, but maybe we're not like all in. Maybe we are curious about the ethical considerations. Maybe we're not sure. Some folks are scaling. And a couple people who are piloting. Some folks are not using AI at all, which is absolutely very real and valid. And then no one else has shared anything really dramatically different otherwise in chat. So thank you all for sharing that with me, because it's just always good, I think, to know where we all are, because this is something that is happening very, very quickly, right? It seems like every day a new function is being, we're not even being presented with the option of do we want to opt in or not. We're just being given it, whether we want it or not. And I think this is a great example that some of us are not using AI at all. Some of us are really completely bought in. And we're in this really interesting transition moment right now. And I think especially when we think about the workplace, workplaces have really just a lot of them have gone all in on AI. And so we're still understanding what that means. And that's really the purpose of today's webinar. So I have a couple things I want to show you too. So think about where you answered that poll just now. So this is from Gallup. And so this was a really recent poll that they just did in Q3 of last year. And they were asking people, do you know if your organization has adopted AI technology or not? And what I thought was really interesting was that They found that 37% of employees who they polled said that their organization has implemented AI technology to do things like improve productivity, efficiency, quality. 40% said that their organization had not, and 23%, nearly a quarter, said that they did not know. And the percentage of those people who said that they did not know was lower than the percentage who reported using AI at work at least a couple times in the last year, but higher than the percentage who reported using it frequently. And so, what that gap kind of indicates to us, at least right now, is that there are employees, and maybe we're in the mix in this too right now, who are using a personal AI tool or using it personally, or in some way using AI without awareness of what the organization's AI strategy. And probably the opposite is true as well too. Now, the reality is that AI usage is continuing to grow, and I only can imagine that this will continue to just hold true as we go through the rest of this year and beyond. And so, again, more data from Gallup out last year. This was based on a survey of 23,000 US adults, so US focused, who were employed full and part time. And they ran the survey from basically during the month of August in the last year. And so what they found was that the percentage of US employees who reported using AI at work at least a couple times a year increased from 40% to 45%. Frequent use, which was defined as a few times a week or more, grew from 19% to 23%, while daily use, it moved a little bit less. So that was moving from 8% to 10%. So, even still, per Gallup, they're telling us that AI daily usage is still limited to about 10% of the American workforce. And I know that not everyone on this webinar today is in the US, and so this may be very different based off of where you are and what your country and what your geographical AI approaches might be. But at least here in the US, it's still limited, even though it might feel like everyone's doing it and every organization is all in on AI. So I've got one more poll for you all, and here's what I want you to tell me, which is how often do you use artificial intelligence in your role? Now, this might be the same answer as kind of you shared earlier, but this might be a little bit different because now this is not necessarily your organization, but just you specifically. How often do you use artificial intelligence in your role if you are working? So we've got daily, a couple times a month, a couple times a week, a couple times a year, once a year, less than once a year, never, or something else. So we'll give it a few more seconds to give people a chance to share. And again, if this is not working for you, if you're like, I don't want to mess around with Slido, as always, feel free to use the chat. All right, so as people are sharing on Slido, I'm also seeing in chat, people are saying daily, once a week, maybe something else. All right, rarely. Yeah, so we got a full spectrum here of folks. As folks are sharing, and I see there's maybe a couple more people just finishing up your voting. Here at Inclusion Geeks, we're using it regularly. We definitely have considerations around it, but we're playing with it, we're experimenting with it, and I think between our roles, different folks are using it in different ways, but we're definitely using it. I would say probably, and Rachel, definitely feel free to chime in if you disagree with me. I would say probably, maybe not daily, but at least a couple times a week, if not more, on my end. All right, so it looks like polling is slowing down. So it looks like we've got about, again, another tie between daily and a few times a month on the poll. A couple of votes for a few times a week, a couple of votes for never, a little bit of vote for a few times a year. And then we've got the chat that I've shared out already. All right, so thank you for sharing. It's always, helpful for me to get a sense of where we all are. So why does it feel like AI is everywhere all of a sudden? I don't know if any of you were watching the Super Bowl, but I did, and I did not love seeing all those AI generated commercials. It was a real shock for me, in all honesty. It seems like AI is everywhere. It seems like it's just kind of hurtling forward at a very quick speed. There are three main reasons that I think we are seeing AI just sort of burst in such a big way. And to someone's point, who I think shared in chat earlier, this is not necessarily anything new, but it's been building for a while, but it just really kind of exploded, especially in the last few years or so. So first reason that we're seeing it everywhere is computing power. And Cloud computing has made massive processing power way more affordable and way more available to organizations. So it's just more, it's easier to actually do this kind of work. Specialized AI chips have become exponentially more powerful. And what the kind of energy and power that we used to need to run a supercomputer now is just running on regular business infrastructure. So it's just a lot more accessible in general. Secondly, we got data availability. So, the internet has just created this like unprecedented volume of text, images, information that it's just out there that is actively being used to train AI systems. Organizations have been digitizing their operations for decades, and so we have these massive data sets that are being used to train these AI tools on. We've also got social media, we've got e-commerce, Internet of Thing devices. I am still pretty much a Luddite when it comes to this kind of stuff. I don't want my fridge and my washing machine to send me text messages when they're done, but we've got all of this stuff that's way more connected. And so we have this constant stream of new training data that's available. Finally, we have accessibility. And so before 2022 or so, most of the AI tools that were out there were mostly like custom built, really expensive. They needed PhD level expertise. But what I think a lot of folks call the Chat GPT moment was in November 2022 when OpenAI publicly launched Chat GPT. And suddenly all of us could access this, right? Anyone who has the internet could access a really sophisticated AI tool. And so there's no coding required. You can literally just pull up your phone and start experimenting immediately. So it's just really readily accessible. So basically, AI went from the research labs and the think tanks to just being available to everybody within a matter of months, not years. And so what's happening in the workforce is organizations are feeling a lot of pressure to adopt quickly or fall behind. But speed without strategy is exactly why we need this conversation around ethics. And because we can't afford to figure out what that ethics piece is going to be later on, because it'll be too late at that point. The technology is already here. Decisions are being made right now that are going to have really long-ranging consequences and implications. So, with that in mind, that leads me to my next point, which is ethical AI considerations. And this is really the question that lies at the core of this entire webinar. So my question for you is ethical AI possible? And I want to know what you think. So let me know what you think. And feel free to share in chat or you can share in Slido. Is ethical AI even possible? Now, I definitely have some thoughts and some feels, but I want to know what you all think before I share my thoughts. All right, so far I got 2 votes for yes, and yes, it's essential. And we have at least one person on chat who's like, yep, I'm working in this space. Yes, love that. And then we got some people who are like, I'm not sure, I'm wondering. A lot of votes for yes here. Yes, it needs to be prioritized. All right, now it's all rolling it. Let me see if I can make sure I capture everyone's thoughts here. So no, I think cooling systems have already done irreversible damage to our environment, not in its current form, run on stolen data, blowing our climate goals. Yes, with legislation and controls. Yes, it needs to be prioritized. Yes, ethical AI is possible, but it would be too limited to be useful. Oops, let me go back to my thing here. Um, Not sure. Yes, with careful planning and consideration, we need to be more ethical. Yes, we can be more ethical. Yes, but 100% ethical. No, that's an interesting thought. I love that. Thank you for sharing that one. Absolutely, but we need governance. Yes, it's essential. And then let me scroll back up for the last new answer here. Possible, yes. Probable, no. So we definitely got a mix of thoughts here. I'll be honest, like I struggle with this question too. I would say that my viewpoint is that, and I'll be really honest, I think this is going to change. So ask me again next month. I may have a really different answer for you. Next year, probably a really different answer too. But right now in February 2026, what my viewpoint is that AI itself cannot be inherently ethical because it lacks consciousness. AI, remember, it's a tool. It's not a sentient being in and of itself. It cannot itself be a moral agent. It is a tool that can be designed to be aligned with human values such as fairness, safety, transparency, the things that we're hoping for and looking for when we're thinking about how to be ethical. But the challenge is really in how do we embed those human-centric values into the systems data, the systems processing? How do we prevent inherited biases? How do we make sure that we're using these tools and applying them in a responsible way? So what I'm going to do next is talk through some really key aspects and considerations that I think about when thinking about what is ethical AI and how can we infuse it, or how can we hope to infuse it into our organizations and our strategy work. So first thing I want to talk about is algorithmic bias and fairness, if my slides cooperate with me. All right, so algorithmic bias is defined as when automated systems produce systematically unfair, discriminatory, or skewed outcomes, and they often reflect or amplify existing human biases in the training data or the design. So this can impact all sorts of areas, hiring, who gets a loan or not, healthcare. And this is where we see that certain groups may be disadvantaged by virtue of their race, gender, socioeconomic status. Causes of algorithmic bias could include biased training data. So for example, if the data is reflecting a historical human bias, like for example, we don't necessarily always see as many women in tech roles, especially in the last, 20, 30 years or so, then the AI is going to learn and perpetuate those patterns. And so then we see what's happening is we get a biased resume screener, for example. Sampling bias, so data samples might not accurately represent the entire or whole population. So if we have a facial recognition tool that's trained on more lighter skin tones, it's going to perform poorly on darker skin tones. And we've seen that be true for a really long time. Flawed design, flawed assumptions. So if we have oversimplification or faulty assumptions in the algorithm's design, that can introduce unfair preferences like favoring older user accounts as being more trustworthy by virtue of nothing else than the fact that it's an older user account. Feedback loops can also produce new biased data because it reinforces the initial problem. So for example, biased policing can lead to more arrests in certain areas, but then that trains the algorithm to focus on those areas more, even though that's actually not what we want to have happen. So how that shows up in the workplace, I mean, really so many different ways. Hiring is one example. So AI could be favoring a male candidate because historical hiring data was more male dominated, or younger candidates because training data reflects age discrimination. There's a lot of new research that's coming out really like daily that's showing that there's research that came out last October, actually. It was published in Nature magazine that shows that when ChatGPT produced resumes for hypothetical women, it generated work histories that portrayed them as younger and less experienced. And so when researchers were asking ChatGPT to evaluate the quality of the resumes, it ended up giving older men higher ratings, even when it was based on the same initial information as the women's resumes. And so what this suggests is that the AI-based tools that people are using to do things like reviewing resumes, kind of sorting through candidates, might end up giving, in this case, older men an advantage while putting older women and younger job seekers at a disadvantage. And so this is basically what the outcome here is, that people may already be experiencing discrimination in an area like hiring. So the LLM is not only reflecting that discrimination, but it's actively amplifying and reinforcing that bias. There's so many other examples, criminal justice and healthcare, facial recognition, we can go on and on. But how can we start to think about mitigating and addressing this kind of bias? Well, data diversity is one way, making sure that we're using really representative and balanced data sets. Human oversight, making sure that we keep a human in the loop, being transparent, being inclusive, and continuously monitoring. So what does this all mean for organizations? Well, first, we need to understand where can bias creep in, because if we don't have the understanding, then we can't adjust for that. We can't monitor for that. We need to understand that this is not just sort of like a one-time thing, or maybe it won't hire one person, or, it will be an isolated use case of something that we don't love. It's going to have long-ranging impacts. It can also create legal risk. It limits your talent pool. There's really a lot of stuff that's going to be happening if you're not really thinking about this really critically. We also want to make sure that organizations are asking some important questions before adopting AI tools. And that's where I'm seeing a lot of lacking, because organizations are just kind of jumping right on in. But we need to ask, what data was this trained on? Has it been tested across different demographic groups? What are the error rates? Do they differ by group? Can we audit the decisions that the tool makes, or are we stuck with it? So all things to keep in mind. All right, next thing I want to talk about is data privacy, security, and consent. And this is the next kind of big consideration, data. What happens to the data that we put into our AI tools? Does anyone know? If you have a thought, if you know, put it in chat. Sometimes it's used to train future models. Sometimes it's used to refine our AI services. It could be, complying with legal requirements. Data could be exposed in a data breach, especially because it's often stored on company servers for long periods of time, even indefinitely. Even if it's deleted from our personal view, it might still be stored somewhere else. And AI tools are also collecting metadata. So that's things like our IP addresses or browsing activity, our types of devices, where we're located. So inputting data into an AI tool is not just about helping us, put a webinar together or answer a question or help structure, a deck that we're doing, stuff like that. It's also thinking about, okay, what is the privacy that, do we have data privacy? What about intellectual property concerns? What about security concerns? And a lot of these generative AI tools are learning from the information they receive. So if you're going to put in sensitive or proprietary data, that could be, or it could lead to outcomes that you're not necessarily hoping for. So some key ethical considerations when we're thinking about data are things like bias and fairness. So, excuse me. Um, are these tools amplifying biases that are present in the data? Is that happening? Is it not happening? Data privacy and confidentiality. So are we putting in personal, confidential, or proprietary information? So that could be student data, patient health data. A lot of doctors are starting to use AI note takers when they're having confidential conversations with their patients, which is raising up a whole host of ethical considerations. There could be data leaks, right? Information could be regurgitated for future responses for other users, and maybe we don't want that to happen. We've already talked a little bit about this, but ownership. Are we breaking intellectual property if we're using and inputting information into different devices and tools? And are we infringing on copyrights? Who owns generated content? Informed consent, another consideration. So a lot of people don't necessarily realize that what we're prompting and what we're uploading could be used for future model training. And so if we don't have an explicit awareness of this when we're using these tools without our consent, that could be an ethical breach. Again, these tools are not always right. They can lie to us, they can hallucinate. And so if we're putting in data into a tool with the expectation that it's always going to be 100% accurate, that's really risky because it could give us false but really, really convincing information. And if we're not aware that we need to double check or have that human insight or oversight, then we could be, putting out or making false or falsely, led decisions and making choices that maybe are not based on reality. And then finally, and I know people have mentioned this already in chat, but environmental and human labor impact. There's just so much energy that's required to process these really large amounts of data. And it can also involve low-paid human labor that's sometimes in really, really harsh conditions. So some best practices for ethical data input. So just really try to never input sensitive, confidential, or personally identifiable information into your tool. Assume that it's public. Any data that's entered into a public AI tool, you should probably try to treat it as if you were posting this on a public forum. Read the privacy policies. Make sure you know what are the policies of the tool that you're using. You may choose to use a different tool because of what their policies are. You want to understand how is the tool handling your data? How is it retaining it? How is it going to use it in the future? Use an enterprise private tool. So make sure that, especially from an organizational standpoint, use an enterprise grade tool that is going to give you that good, really strict data privacy, and it's not going to use the input to train the model. So you have more of a sandbox to play in that's a bit more protected. Making sure that you're making your data anonymous. And so before you put in data, remove any identifying information to protect privacy. Verify the output. So we have to have that human manual verification and cross-reference to make sure that we're catching any hallucinations or biased information. And then really, especially from an organizational perspective, create some very clear policies around what data can or cannot be used with AI. Because even if you have all of these protections, if you have an enterprise level AI tool, what's to stop you or your colleague or an intern, anyone from taking sensitive information and then taking that and putting it into a non-enterprise AI tool, right? Do we have a policy around that? Do we have guidelines? Do we have boundaries? I was just reading the other day about an author, and a lot of authors use what they call beta readers, so people who are reading early drafts of their, their novel or short story, whatever it might be, to get input and feedback. And this author was posting online about how she had a beta reader who uploaded her entire novel into an AI tool. And now she needs to go back and update her contract language and her NDA language to include specific provisions so that this does not happen in the future. Because now her entire novel exists as data for some tool that she did not want to be used for. All right, so that's a little bit about data. Now I want to talk a bit more about AI in the workplace specifically. So there's some new research that's just come out, and this image is actually from a Harvard Business Review article that's highlighting some of this research that shows that AI tools don't really reduce work. They are intensifying it. And so there's these studies that are coming out that show that people are working at faster paces. We're taking on more, a broader scope of work and tasks. We're working longer. And so it seems like AI is really useful and it is really helpful in a lot of ways, but this is not just sort of a simple AI helps us be better or be more productive, because what's also happening is things like workload creep, cognitive fatigue, burnout. We're lowering our own decision-making capabilities. And so there's this surgence of what a lot of people are calling AI slop, where, okay, we're doing stuff really quickly, but the output itself is bad, or it's not good, or it's just, not what we want it to be. And then the other thing I want to mention, because I really would be remiss if I didn't mention this, is the devastating impact that AI usage can have and does have really on our environment and our water supply, our climate in general. So this particular image that I'm showing on the screen is from a 2019 article, so it's a bit older, but still super relevant. This is from researchers at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And what they were doing is quantifying the approximate financial and environmental costs of training a variety of AI tools. And they were providing some recommendations for how we could lessen the harmful impact of this. And so as you can see here, it's really quite remarkable, right? The amount of energy it takes to travel from New York to San Francisco for one person versus the amount of energy it takes to train an AI model. There's just really not even any comparison. I mean, we look here, we see human life, the average American life, manufacturing, and, in terms of building a car and fuel consumption, all of this pales in regards to the amount of just, water, energy, all the stuff that is required to use and train these models. And the global AI energy demand is projected to exponentially increase to at least 10 times the current level. And it's researchers have been anticipating that this is going to exceed the annual electricity consumption of a small country like Belgium by 2026, which is the year we are in right now. In the US, the AI demand they're predicting that it's going to lead us to have data center energy consumption be about 6% of our entire total electricity usage in 2026. And so again, I think this really kind of highlights this reality where, especially for those of us in the US, if you're of a certain age, I know I sort of grew up thinking, oh, I've got to turn off the lights to save electricity. And I still am very much in that mindset when I'm at home. I'm like, turn off the lights, make sure I'm not using a lot of power. It honestly doesn't matter, right? Because me asking something in ChatGPT or Claude is using so much more energy. And it's not even just me as an individual, it's our organizations, it's our government, it's everyone that's just using these tools. It does have a real significant impact on our climate, on our water supply. And there's also very much a widening disparity in how different regions and different communities are impacted and affected by the environmental impacts of AI usage. Because in a lot of cases, what we're seeing is that communities that are historically marginalized or under-resourced are also the ones that are taking on a disproportionate burden of these environmental impacts. So for example, in 2022, Google, the company, operated its data center in Finland, and they were using that, and they're operating on 97% carbon-free energy, which is great. But if we look at Google's data centers and what that energy usage looks like in places like Asia, it actually drops to between 4 to 18%. So we're seeing already that these different parts of the world are taking on a different burden in terms of what this is going to how it's going to impact communities. And we're already seeing really dire predictions around the limited amount of the world's water supply that we're basically running out, right? Now, this is just a webinar. It's a 1 hour time frame. We're not going to solve all the problems, but here's a couple final thoughts around this point that I just want to kind of leave you with. So if your organization is using AI, here's a couple more things to keep in mind. So kind of overall, again, I always just default to frame AI as a tool that must be managed. It's not inevitable. It's not a person. It's not a human being. It's a tool, and we can manage these tools. So first, identify what I call, or what we are calling, AI washing. So some companies are using AI as a way to get rid of people, rid of human workers, but it's giving them a way to not call it a layoff, but saying, oh, well, AI is taking over, as opposed to just saying we need to lay people off. So reframe the conversation. Again, is it because we're implementing AI? Is it because companies want to just, lay people off? There's a lot of examples that a lot of companies, especially in the last year, are acting in anticipation of future AI efficiencies rather than current proven gains. So there's, again, so many examples, Salesforce, Amazon, Klarna, Duolingo. We talked about Duolingo in last summer's AI webinar. Pinterest, a lot of companies are almost sort of preemptively bending the knee, if you will. Try to understand, where is the job displacement real, which it is real in a lot of cases, but also where is it real versus where does it augment, or where could it augment human work? And because the reality is that using AI sometimes can sort of mask over hiring. And again, it's this anticipation versus reality. Because one study has found that while a lot of executives are using AI as an excuse for why they're making, workplace shifts or downsizing, really only about 2% of these executives and organizations have actually implemented AI on a scale that justifies these really large immediate headcount reductions. A lot of companies have actually had to rehire in order to fix their mistakes. Use that equity lens. Which workers are most vulnerable? Which, are most going to be impacted? A lot of times we're looking at lower wage workers with less formal education. Could we upskill them instead of replacing them? Customer service is one area that I think this question is very, very pertinent on. Center the employee voice. So make sure that we're doing things like having focus groups with our staff before we select a tool. Use anonymous surveys to get a sense of how your people are thinking and feeling about AI. Are there concerns? Are there hopes? Are there desires? Are there fears? Do a pilot program, implement regular feedback mechanisms, make sure that you are thinking about this, again, from a transparent standpoint, that you're bringing in different voices, making sure that you are geographically distributing AI computing across varied data centers. This one I think is really important, because this is a thought that you can kind of put out there, no matter if you work for a large company or a really small company. If you are working for a large company that operates its own geographically distributed data infrastructure, you could think about, and again, not all of us are in these decision-making roles, but you can think about, how could we, move some of our computing tasks to other data centers without impacting our services? If you're working for a smaller company, could we dynamically, shift? Could we be more flexible in terms of shifting our computing needs across different cloud regions, right? Because if we're being a little bit more fair, if we're distributing a little bit better across different data centers, then that helps us distribute or redistribute rather the regional environmental costs that AI does come with, and that hopefully could be a little bit more equitable. Because from an individual standpoint, there's really not necessarily a ton we can do. I would say, from an individual standpoint, like I would caution against, buying into the latest, like, Facebook image craze of like redo your profile picture with AI. Do you really need that? Probably not. Really just try to use AI judiciously. Again, I do use AI personally, and within the context of the work that we do at Inclusion Geeks, but I'm not using it to just, I'm not using it as a search engine. I'm using it for specific targeted tasks. All right, so we have about a little bit under 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So I just want to give you a couple final practical steps forward. So a couple of things I want to leave you with. First is who gets to decide what your strategy is? And these are just a couple kind of questions that I think are important for us to keep in mind. Is there an AI strategy? Who sets the strategy? Whose voices are included? Whose voices are missing from these strategies? Are we keeping humans in the loop? Are we using and maintaining our data and our data sets responsibly? Do we have plans in place to mitigate risk? What happens if things go awry? What happens if someone takes our data and puts it into a different tool? Who's monitoring for bias? Who's handling complaints? Who can pause or override an AI decision? And again, is that even possible? Here's a sample action plan if you're thinking about, okay, what can I do immediately? So first, conduct an AI audit. What tools are already in use? You might be surprised, in all honesty. Maybe there's not as many as you think there are. Maybe there's a lot more than you think there are. Draft a value statement. What principles do you want to use to guide AI usage in your organization? Create space for dialogue. So that could be, again, surveys, listening sessions, making sure that you're bubbling up any concerns, any hopes, any opportunities around AI specifically. Develop vendor evaluation criteria. So make sure that you're including questions around things like ethics, not just how much does it cost, what features does it provide, but also that ethical lens. Start small. You don't have to do everything all at once, right? You can learn, you can pilot, you can then scale, get some feedback, you can iterate, and then really just keep those feedback loops open. All right, so with that being said, I think, oh yes, final recap. I'll come back to this actually, but I want to make sure we have enough time for some Q&A. So I'm going to pause here for Q&A. I know the chat has been going fast and furious, and we do have some questions that were submitted beforehand, but I do want to prioritize live questions first. So with that in mind, does anyone have a question that you'd like to ask? I will allow you to either unmute yourself or ask in chat. I see there's one or two things coming in already. All right, so first question I'm seeing pop up on my end are, I haven't really addressed huge ethical problems with current generative AI when I'm still in data, environmental impact, venture capital, trillions of dollars. How can we possibly use these current tools ethically? So the reality, Paul, is you're absolutely right. And this is a free 1 hour webinar. We're not going to talk about all the things, and there's just no way we can actually dig into all of this in the time frame and in the context right now. So this is really just kind of a brief overview, but I agree with you completely. I go back to the question I asked you all in the beginning of this webinar, which is, is this even possible? Is ethical AI even possible? And again, I think there's mixed feelings on it. I think that in a lot of senses, the cat is out of the bag, if you will. Unless a major crash happens, which could be possible, we're probably not going to really see a huge rollback of AI usage anytime soon. So the reality is we have these tools that are in existence. How can we continue to use them or make sure that we manage them in a more ethical way? And I think from that standpoint, my default is just making sure that we're continually pushing for ethics to be part of the conversation and not something that comes on later on. Because if it's coming later on, it's already too late. And in some cases, and you may argue, and I may agree with you that it may be too late already. Don't know for sure at this point. Tomar asked, how likely are vendors going to disclose their training data bias? Honestly, I can't really say as someone who's not an AI vendor myself. I would say that again, these are why these questions are really important because you want to understand not just can I get a yes or no. I would be truly shocked if any vendor out there were to tell a potential client, yes, our data set is biased. They're not going to say that, right? They may not even realize it or know it themselves, right? But that's where we come into play. So that's where we have to really dig into it. We have to ask, where are these data sets coming from? How are, who created them? How are they trained? What are the outcomes? What are the false positives? What are, the where are the cases that it made a mistake? We have to be really critical and we can't just rely on a pat answer from a vendor. So that's where we do have to do our own work and dig deeper. And in all honesty, I think we have to assume that at a certain extent, any data set is going to be biased because if you've been to any of my past trainings around bias and sort of that those sorts of topics in the past, you'll know that one of the things I say all the time to clients and to folks like you all here on our webinars is that human beings are inherently biased. We all carry bias within us. We cannot erase our biases. What we can do is we can understand better where our biases come from, where they pop up, when they pop up, and then we can take steps to mitigate them in a process, in a system, in a platform, in a tool. So that's exactly that dynamic that I'm talking about. So instead of just saying, we don't, we're not going to monitor how these tools are learning and what kind of data they're using, we have to go into it from some standpoint and think these tools are biased. So how do we work backwards and mitigate the biases that already exist in these tools? All right, let's see. Got some more stuff coming through. Let me see what we've got in the chat. These are really great questions, right? These are important questions, and the reality is like we're not going to answer all these questions today. The best minds don't have answers to these questions, right? Like we're seeing so much discussion happening, and that's why I think it's just for a starting point, it's important to have these discussions because we need to be asking these questions, even though we may not have the answers at this point. We may never have the answers. All right, this person said, I'm struggling with shadow AI. I can't stop people from using AI that wasn't sanctioned by the organization. Yeah, that's a really, really tough one. Again, I think that's where you have to put in place some really clear policies. So you may not be able to stop people, but if and when you catch people, what happens? How does that play out? Is it a fireable offense? Like those are all considerations to kind of keep in mind. Um, Depending on your industry, your organization, do we go back to like not allowing personal devices in the workplace? Like, I don't know, right? These are all things we have to think about, especially from an organizational standpoint. Um, Thank you. There's some folks who are sharing some resources. Yes, we at Inclusion Geeks love the All Tech is Human community. There's tons of communities that are actually popping up that are out there. All Tech is Human is amazing. Love that one. They have a great Slack community. Thank you for sharing this article about the invisible labor behind AI. Absolutely. I mean, I was just talking with Rachel actually yesterday or day before about Waymo, right? Waymo hasn't really made its way out to where I live in Massachusetts, but it's very common out here on the West Coast in different areas. And again, is it specifically AI? Is it not? I think we can argue that point. But there was this, news sort of flash that came out recently where it's like, oh, actually, it's not AI. It's not, technology. It's humans in the Philippines. We're actually piloting these cars, right? There's a lot of this invisible labor that's kind of behind it. Um, yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So I'm not seeing anything pop up in chat. Let me quickly go to the Eventbrite questions to see if there's anything that we can answer quickly. A lot of your questions, just to be honest, or not to be honest, to be transparent with you all, were you were asking the same questions you're asking right now. Can we have ethical AI? Is it even possible? People were, yeah, actually, a lot of the questions were basically like, is this even possible? How do we take environmental impacts into account? How do we take into account the adverse impacts on the humans who work on the back end? How can we avoid climate issues? So we're all asking the same questions. And, unfortunately, like we don't have all the answers, but the point is that we're having these discussions and we need to have more of them.